Now we have Michele Brown, who's the Chief Attorney at Children's Legal Center of Buffalo, and Dr. Frank Alabiso to speak to us on a very interesting topic. Please help me welcome Dr. Alabiso and Michele Brown. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to start. We're here to talk about the intersection of personality disorders and conflict. The type of conflict we're talking about isn't families fighting at home. We're talking about how personality disorders manifest in the sort of manners we handle in conflict and court battles, as people like to call it. And the personality disorder folks are the folks who walk in the door looking pretty normal and turn into nightmares for us. We're not talking about the extremes. Mo Hassan, for example, I'm not going to call him a gentleman, the monster who beheaded his wife. We're not talking about somebody like that. We're not talking about Ulner Steele, the man who was sentenced to 36 years in jail for beating his wife and having his 13-year-old son videotape the beating. We're not talking about kind of just crazy folks either. I'll give you an example of a crazy folk we're not talking about. It's my new favorite case. You can take a look later today. It's an alienation case at ES versus SS. 63 miscellaneous 3rd, 1206A. It's a family court decision from Bronx County Family Court, March 18th, 2019. The father's claiming the mother has alienated him from the children, and there's a lot of things going on, but the one I like best, and I'm going to read from the decision, is when questioned whether the petitioner was the father of the children, the respondent testified she does not know the petitioner or anything about him. She further testified petitioner is not the father of the children. Respondent testified the subject children only biological and spiritual father is God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. We're not talking about those crazy folks either, okay? We're talking about those normal nightmare folks. Now, we're all attorneys. A couple of years ago, I had the great, I don't want to say pleasure because I felt very inadequate in this event, but I spoke with Dr. Jeffrey Whitman. He's Tim Tippin's psychologist that he uses all the time, and we were talking about how the law handles things and how they should be handled from a psychological viewpoint, and he clearly had the goods on me. I'm not going to pretend today to be a psychologist. We're attorneys. I know what I do. I know what each of you do. And we know when people walk into our office, some of them just aren't right. Do you know what I mean? Just aren't right. But we have an expert here today who can explain to us what's just not right about it. Before we go any farther and before Dr. Alabiso takes his turn, I don't know if everyone in this room is aware, but yesterday Dr. Alabiso received a Law Day Award for his contributions to our community. He got it for 3 primary reasons. The first is all the work he's done with our families, both in counseling and in doing custodial evaluations. The second reason is because he trained a whole new bunch of custodial evaluators when there was no one in our community who was willing to do the work. And the third reason is for his contributions to the Attorneys for Children program by speaking and preparing the materials he does without compensation. So,
Thank you.
Dr. Alabiso, our expert.
Thank you very much. When I received notification that I was receiving the Justice Award, I cried. I was so gratified, and I thank all of you and judges and lawyers who think well of me. I want to talk a bit about personality disorders and what you're likely to see in dealing with parents of children that you represent, clients of your own, past, present, or future. But before that, I just want to tell you this little anecdotal story. All week as I've been running into attorneys in one venue or another, I've been asking attorneys if they're happy. And about half of them told me they weren't. And I asked them, why are you not happy? And they said, it's the clients. They expect so much of us. They don't leave us alone. They don't listen to our advice. And oftentimes, they're angry with us. And these are the kind of clients that we're going to be talking about today. That group of clients that are just extremely difficult to deal with and cause us to not enjoy our work. So I'm just going to overview that for you, and then I'll turn it back to Michele, and then I'll come back in. Generally, this comes under the category of personality disorders. Most of you will not see parents who are fully diagnosable with a personality disorder. What you're going to see is various traits of personality disorders in the parents of your clients, so that it's these traits that make their interpersonal relationships difficult. By definition, personality disorder is an inability to relate well to others. It represents an impairment in interpersonal relationships. People with personality disorders or personality disorder traits have a distorted perception of themselves and a distorted perception of others. They have a disturbed range of emotional reactions. They tend to be depressed, anxious, angry, difficult in their relationships. And the pattern is consistent across situations, whatever situation they're in. If they find they're having problems with people, getting along with people. And if we were to believe the literature on this, the position of the American Psychiatric Association on this, these patterns are not very modifiable. They seem to be lifelong patterns. So what are those traits that they have that make them difficult for us to deal with? They lack empathy. They lack a capacity for intimacy. They have negative affect. They're angry, anxious, depressed. They feel guilt, shame, humiliation, anger. We all have these emotions, but they have them in a disproportionate way. They're detached. They tend to be antagonistic. They can be disinhibited. So today we're going to talk about 5 of those disorders, the traits associated with those disorders, and how they play out in your office with parents of children that you're representing. So we'll talk about the histrionic pattern, the obsessive-compulsive pattern, narcissistic pattern, an antisocial pattern. You won't see very many of those in your office, but what you will see is a subset of those, which are parents who are sociopathic. You'll see parents who have traits for borderline personality disorder. And then there's a 6th category I hope we can get to today. It's not a personality disorder, and that is those parents who manifest with pathological hatred. Paradoxically, we've all seen them, we remember them, and yet if you look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, the word hatred is only mentioned twice and never in connection with a form of mental illness. Michele?
So how we're going to structure this is I'm going to run through some facts, and based on the facts I've run through, Dr. Alabiso is going to talk about the personality type and how we as attorneys and AFCs can deal maybe with this type of personality more effectively. So our first example is Sam. Anybody knows me knows I'm using my own kid for that example. Sam's mom and dad meet when they're both employed at a local hospital. They have a torrid affair, and that torrid affair ends mom's marriage when she realizes she's pregnant. When you first meet Dad, he is the most enthralling character in the universe. Mom describes her relationship with him as flowers and gifts and the best sex she ever had. He was a very attentive lover. He worshiped her, catered to her, massaged her feet and her back. He's just great. After Sam's born, the relationship starts to deteriorate, and Dad starts saying, I would be the better parent. And one of the things he points to in being the better parent is this perfect nursery he's created for the baby in his mother's home. He becomes relentless. He files petition after petition after petition in family court, always believing he's not really heard and that he hasn't had an opportunity. I see you smiling. You've seen this, right? He hasn't really had an opportunity to be heard by the court. Ultimately, in a very dramatic gesture, he jumps on a chair in the waiting room in family court and starts screaming about parents' rights. How do I deal with this cat?
We've all been there. The people with this pattern have are demonstrating a histrionic panic. Now, the example given has many mixed features in it. There's some elements of being narcissistic, there's some elements in it of being histrionic, but mostly what we're seeing here is a histrionic pattern. So with individuals who have these traits, they tend to be likable initially when we meet them. They're likable, they're gregarious, they're attention-seeking, and then the problem in their personality traits that give us the most difficulty is that they're overly dramatic. They overreact to every situation, and in doing that, they generate more conflict, more polarization, and reduce the likelihood of being able to settle the case. And they do this through, in terms of your clients, the children, they do this through the children. So you'll be faced with that. The question is, you know, how do we deal with this? What's the best way to try and deal with them? These folks have insatiable needs for approval and attention. And they will seek that from you as long as you will give it, as much as you will give it. They seek drama, and they morph their case into the biggest, the worst, the most upsetting. They're affectatious. They perceive themselves as having a personal relationship with you. You ever have those ones where you meet them twice and they say, "What'd you do this weekend, Frank?" Okay, they assume a sense of personal relationship with you when there really is not that level of relationship. So in terms of dealing with them from the get-go, you can be lulled into seeing them more positively than they are because, again, they're attention-seeking, they're approval-seeking, and they're gregarious. But once you start to sense that there's a histrionic pattern, you need not to indulge it. You need to be direct with them and firm with them, but never disapproving. Okay? So it's a balance you have to walk. As soon as you're disapproving, since the driving mechanism for them is approval and attention, as soon as you're disapproving of them and they sense that, you'll find that your work with them will start to become more and more negative. So I'd be firm with them, I'd be consistent with them, I wouldn't indulge their overly dramatic reactions to and demands for service or change or filing petitions or show cause orders or emergency appearances in the court, but at the same time, I wouldn't criticize.
So now here's the second half of our little problem. We're going to address it once or twice today. Histrionic personality disorder isn't necessarily limited to adults. It can start to manifest in adolescence. So now I've got my little client, Sam. I'm the AFC, right? And he's his father's clone. This kid is exactly like his dad. He's active in every club at school, but can't figure out why he wasn't elected class president. He has a lot of acquaintances, few close friends. He believes he's the most popular kid in the school. He's very concerned with his appearance. He always has to have the latest and the best of everything. My question is this kid diagnosable? If not, will he be someday?
He may be.
And how do I manage him?
He may be. Adolescents' personalities and children's personalities are still in formation, so we don't diagnose them with these disorders. We can recognize the emergence of these traits, but it's when a preponderance of these traits coalesce and form a character within the person, then we're looking at personality disorders, and typically we don't see those until adulthood. So what you're seeing is the emergence of these traits in the child, but children are still nonetheless impressionable, and they're still better able to be influenced So in dealing with them, again, I think you have to be connecting with them, but firm with them, and not critical of them, but at the same time making it clear to them that you don't always agree with how they see it or what they want. And this comes up from time to time in cases where, more severe cases where you find yourself questioning, could this be a substitute judgment case, where these kids, some of these kids are so absolutely negative, not necessarily alienated, but absolutely negative towards one or the other parent, and they're dramatic in their presentation.
Let's go on to another fact pattern. I have Rachel. Rachel's mom insists Dad has a substance abuse problem. Dad acknowledges he smokes weed occasionally and drinks socially, but denies his use being a problem. She and Rachel, Rachel's 14 by the way, are in counseling with the same counselor to address their issues, their joint issues, with Dad's substance abuse. Mom's also enrolled Rachel in Alateen, so she has support from peers where there's other substance abusing parents. Mom keeps saying she wants Dad to have a good relationship with Rachel, but insists his access needs to be supervised. Mom finally agrees Dad can have overnight access with Rachel, but after court denies that she really agreed. She continues to assert that Rachel should have only supervised access. In addition to being supervised, it should be occurring in her home under her supervision where she knows it'll be correct and Rachel will be protected and comfortable.
So these folks, their personalities tend to be rigid, fixed in their thinking, and not very amenable or open to change. This is an obsessive compulsive pattern. They conceal their discordant attitudes and they're perfectionistic, and they measure their rightness by how perfectionistic they are. Often they will associate themselves or affiliate themselves with an organization or an individual that can't be criticized. So these people are people who will say, I'm following the protocol or the pattern that was listed in Dr. So-and-so's book. And they'll gain status by affiliation. So the three main characteristics are the rigidity, the inflexibility, the concealment of discordant attitudes, and the perfectionism. And so what happens when you're dealing with them is their demands are unrealistic, or their expectations are unrealistic because they're overly perfectionistic. And just about the time you think that a case might settle, they change their position because they feel that they haven't gotten everything that they believe is the right thing for their child in the case. And so it's difficult to move with those parents. It's difficult for their attorneys to move them towards settlement. These individuals have needs for control over every detail in the case. And they see the attorney as really not only acting on their behalf, but they see themselves as directing their attorney. They oftentimes don't take advice from their attorney. They oftentimes think that they know better, when in fact they don't. They conceal their discordant attitudes, so they will yes you to death until it comes time to settle a case, and then they reverse. And you find yourself feeling like, I just thought this case was going to settle, and now we're going to trial, because they won't bend on what we would think of as some minor detail, or they don't have a sense of trading off something they are willing to give up in order to get something they want that would make a settlement go forward. So these folks are hypersensitive to criticism, and if you find yourself falling into that trap where you begin to feel critical of them, if they sense that, what you're going to find is not that they get less rigid, that you'll find they get more rigid. Because they conceal their discordant attitudes and have the appearance of being agreeable with you, okay, it's a good idea to ask them, what haven't you told me? What is it that I don't understand about what you want to see happen for your child? Now, I understand that you're not their attorney, but as Michelle pointed out to me, most attorneys for children get bombarded by parents one way or another. And they put a lot of pressure on us. And a lot of the attorneys that I talked to in that small sample last week of "Are you happy?" were attorneys for children who said to me, "It's the parents. I can handle the kids, it's the parents." So ask them what they haven't told you. What is it they're concealing? What is the discordant attitude, so that there's no surprises in the case?
Another adolescent question on this one, too. So Rachel, who's the subject of this custody dispute, is a straight A student and accomplished gymnast. She joins with her mother in thinking that dad's access should be supervised at the home so she's safe. She's headed for the Junior Olympics. She's an all-around great achiever, but your sense as her AFC is either there's something wrong here with her, or she's maybe overly connected to her mom. Do we have a budding OCD or overconnected?
Probably budding OCD.
How can you tell?
When children are overconnected, what you'll see with them is that they either have a pattern of affinity. So when you go back and track the history, you'll find that they always felt closest to one parent rather than the other. That the other parent, the non-preferred parent, or less preferred parent, has always been sort of peripheral to the child's upbringing. And so those children have a close affinity for one parent, and you'll hear them, they'll say it to you. They'll say, "I just love being with my mom. My friends think she's the best mom. They want to come to our house. I start a sentence and my mom finishes it." The sense of real affinity. You also get kids who now become unlike kids who show an affinity, kids who have an alignment. So these children are children who have been pulled into an us and him or us and her scenario, where the parent has drawn them into the sense of an alignment against the other parent. These are kids who have a moral judgment against the other parent. She's a scoundrel, he's a scoundrel, he caused the family to fall apart. He's the reason, she's the reason, and they are exposed to that by the other parent. In an obsessive compulsive pattern, you more have the case of a child who's more rigid, who can't be flexible, and is very focused on right and wrong. And so they take a position with one parent against the other parent, not based on affinity, not based on alignment, but based on their sense of rightness.
So if you're representing kids, just to play with this for a second, how do you start to distinguish that he's a scoundrel versus the rightness? Because it's a different concept, right?
Yes. The sense of this parent is a scoundrel is based on the belief that the parent has been amoral or immoral in some way. This usually comes up in cases of infidelity in the marriage. And so you'll hear them say, "My father or my mother's a bad person." Okay. As opposed to kids who are very rigidly tied to rules and doing things correctly and following a protocol. So for those kids, their focus is on doing the right thing. And for kids who have an alignment, their focus is on what they consider to be the immoral character of one or the other parent.
So that involves a lot of client interview and interaction to try to figure out what's going on.
Yes,
So back to our guidelines, which is have a relationship with your client.
that's right.
Okay. Okay, we've got Zoe. Mom and dad meet on the internet, and after a whirlwind courtship, mom becomes pregnant. They separate after Zoe was born, in part because dad was convinced mom was abusive to Zoe, and he was a much superior parent. Dad genuinely believes that Zoe would thrive under his sole care and that mom and her family are simply not necessary. He believes her family's full of alcoholics and molesters. The family has been through the court system repeatedly since Zoe was born. In court, Dad keeps interrupting the judge and the attorneys, including his own attorney, to tell it the way it really is.
So
Doctor.
Yeah, so what happens, what you encounter with these folks is they tend to be self-absorbed. They have an admiring self-image. They're just very convinced that they're the better parent, that they're the admirable parent, and that their views are right. They show a diminished capacity for being able to be reciprocal or being able to give back, and they lack reciprocity across the board, including in their relationships with their attorneys, and they're willing to exploit others. So that would be the full-blown pattern of a narcissistic personality. And I hear this all the time in the office when I'm doing custody evaluations. One parent will come in and say that the other parent is a narcissist. And I hear it from the attorneys. The attorneys will say to me, boy, is that parent a narcissist? Well, what we tend to see is not the full-blown pattern, but we tend to see several of those traits, 2 or 3 or more of those traits in a given parent. These are people where the underlying psychic driving mechanism is that their early development in life has been one in which they weren't endorsed, they weren't praised, they didn't have an external supply of self-esteem, so they supply their own self-esteem. So they think they're the best, they think they're the wisest, and they will tell you in one form or another. They'll say, well, I'm on the school board. I volunteered to chaperone the father-daughter dance. I took the kids around to raise money for the school trip. And they'll go on and they'll give themselves all kinds of accolades for all the things they've done and tell you what a good parent they are. And maybe they actually do these things, and that's not a bad thing. The problem is they can't say one good thing about the other parent. That their view is that anything that's positive about the other parent diminishes their esteem. So they don't have any balance, and as a result of that, they vilify the other parent. They see the other parent as the cause of the child's problems, and they're not willing to compromise much when it comes time to settlement or when it comes time to trial. So I think a tip in dealing with them is to recognize their efforts to be a good parent, but to tell them that they lack balance, and that the problem in getting their case resolved, or the problem for them, if you were an attorney for them, the problem for them at a trial is going to be that they will show no empathy for the other parent. They'll be seen as exploitative. They'll be seen as not being able to reciprocate. It won't help their case any.
So if I was to meet this guy as a teenager, what kind of things would I be seeing that might be precursors to this narcissistic personality disorder as an adult?
Yeah, the precursors are these. They're similar, but they're not fixed and congealed into a personality disorder. So you'll see that these kids rely on rationalization. They'll justify what they do. They'll rationalize it. They tend to be manipulative, and some of their arguments against one parent or the other are clearly contrived. They have an overly high opinion of themselves, and you'll find that in their relationships with their siblings, their parents, and others, they tend to be exploitative.
So how does a teenager be exploitative in a relationship? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, they'll have an agenda. They'll know what they want. They'll take advantage of another person, another kid, a sibling, a parent. They'll take advantage of that person. They'll get what they want or what they need from that person, and then they're unwilling to give anything back.
So having raised teenagers and dealt with a lot of teenagers over the years, that's kind of true of kids in general, isn't it?
Oh, I think we see this, some of these traits, and this is one of the reasons why we don't identify these as personality disorders and such in children and adolescents. So all of these traits are part of the human spectrum of adjustment. And if we look at ourselves, we can find these traits in ourselves as well. The problem being that with these kids, there's a preponderance of these traits that really come to define their personality.
Fair enough. Okay. So we've got Susan. Mom and dad are married, both employed in the food service industry as chefs. Dad's repeatedly fired for inappropriate conduct at work, not coming in, not showing up, not calling in, making sexual innuendos and passes at other employees, profanity at work, throwing objects at people when he gets frustrated, just lack of self-control overall. Because dad can't maintain employment, mom winds up maintaining the family on her income. Finally, dad is charged with assault and the marriage ends. After dad serves his period of incarceration, he tries to return to the marriage, and failing that return because mom finally got smart, he tries to re-engage with his daughter Susan, who's 6 now. Susan is a virtual stranger with her father. But mom, trying to give dad another chance, agrees that Susan can attend dad's family picnic. At the family picnic, dad becomes so frustrated with Susan's behavior that he winds up spanking her, but he spanks her so hard he leaves bruises on her marks and on her thighs and her buttocks. Dad denies spanking her and says, oh no, she fell over a log. And then when he's confronted, he says that mom convinced Susan to lie. Is this a guy I want around one of my clients?
These are antisocial personality types. If you looked at the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, they have a history of criminal behavior, lack of remorse, lack of impulse control, carelessness, behavioral irresponsibility, and a shameless exploitation of others. You probably won't see many of those in your office. You won't see many of these parents in your course of working with children, partially because they're not the kind of folks who go through the legal system to address their problems. They just take matters into their own hands. They make their own rules, and they raise Cain with other people's lives. What you're more likely to see is more of a sociopathic pattern. Individuals with a sociopathic pattern, which is a subgroup of antisocial personality disorder, individuals with that pattern tend to be likable, they're manipulative, they're very clever socially. You'll find yourself feeling convinced by what they say. Their intention is to gain power and control over others, including in the case of a custody case over the other parent. They may not be all that interested in the children. They want to win, and they want to have that upper hand over the other parent. They can be very deceptive because they're likable, and they tend to mix truths and half-truths with lies, so that when they tell you something, there's enough truth in what they tell you to be believable, and there's enough lie in it to get what it is they want. Okay, so these folks, especially those who lean more towards the antisocial type, have needs for power and control. They act in their own self-interest. They're difficult to deal with. The ones that are more deceptive and that you can find yourself pulled more into their way of thinking are the sociopathic types. And you have to be aware that they're interested in power and control. They're acting in their self-interest. They're not so much primarily interested in their children. They're interested in getting what they want.
So, as attorneys and AFCs, how do you deal with one of these kids? Let me ask you a question before we go further. I always think of antisocial people as being more predominantly male. Am I wrong in that?
No, I think they are. I mean, demographically, if you look at the statistics, there is a gender difference there. And antisocial males tend to be more aggressive, and their criminal acts are less white collar and more crimes of violence.
So one of these cats come into my office wanting custody of his kid. How do I deal with him?
Black and white. You have to deal with these parents from a position of control. You have to communicate to them from day one that you're in charge of representing your client, that you're running your case, they're not running your case, and you have to challenge their efforts to gain control over you or to manipulate you or get in the upper power position. And it will be back and forth, and if you do that, those parents are likely to complain about you. They're likely to, they may even withdraw from the case, withdraw their petition, and then try and refile, find another way to do it, try and refile later, seeking out a different attorney for the child.
So, of these personality types, which one is most apt to grieve, that we've dealt with so far, which one's most apt to grieve the AFC for perceived injustice?
Usually the narcissistic type is the most likely. Obsessive compulsive would be probably next most likely. Antisocial, not so much, because they usually take matters in their own hand and try to circumvent the court and try and get what they want from the other parent by manipulating and controlling the other parent.
Now, what would this person, this antisocial type person, look like as an adolescent walking into our office?
These kids tend to be impulsive. They tend to have a history of being irresponsible. They act out. They're often deviant in one way or another, sometimes in minor ways, sometimes in more serious ways. So they may show up as a PINS petition type case and so forth. But basically, what you'll see in them is a pattern of irresponsibility, impulsivity, tendency to act out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's try Joe. Mom and Dad have 3 kids, 19, 17, and 5. The youngest, Joe, is the subject of a custody dispute. He enjoys spending time with his dad, but Mom is absolutely convinced that Dad is molesting Joe. Sometimes she's convinced, although there's no evidence to support the belief, and Joe's made no statements of the molestation to anyone, including Mom. She claims it happened one day, and then the next day she retracts that statement. So she's inconsistent. Mom, interestingly enough, doesn't have a relationship with her own family. She hasn't talked to her own parents in over 3 years. She's furious with Dad for forcing the family to move from Florida to Buffalo, even though he had to accept the transfer to maintain employment, and he got a substantial raise. During the last 3 years of the marriage, Mom's refused to have sexual relations with Dad. She claimed he needed sex therapy because she caught him watching online pornography. By the way, that was after 1 year of no relations was the online pornography. And she's now taking the position she's not going to have sexual relations with him until he's cured. But if he's not cured, they could go on in their marriage or not, depending on the day. Sometimes she wants to be divorced, sometimes not. What do we have here?
This is a borderline personality pattern. Psychologists, therapists of other professional training, and attorneys dread these parents because they have an unstable core self. So they can change at any given time what it is they want. So what you find is, if you were representing that parent, what you find is a parent who's all for the divorce, all for sole custody. Next thing you know, maybe they've changed their mind, maybe they're going to settle, maybe they want to reconcile, maybe they still love him or her. The pattern is one of, I hate you, don't leave me. And so they're very fluid in what they want and what they're seeking. And as a result, they can change what they seek at any given time in the court proceedings. So they're very difficult to bring to any kind of willingness to settle or any kind of willingness to pursue the trial itself. They're back and forth, back and forth. This comes from an unstable self-image. They don't have a good sense of core self, so their sense of core self is like a kaleidoscope, an internal kaleidoscope. It's always changing, always changing. The basis for this originates during childhood. It comes from difficulties with attachment. So as adults, they are terrified of abandonment, and it sets off a complete disequilibrium within them, and they vacillate between being crushed and being furious. And it comes from being cared for by caregivers during childhood, where the caregiver is the one who hurts the child. Okay, that the person who's supposed to love you is the person who hurts you. And in the marriage, it's exactly how they view their spouse. But the person who's supposed to love me is the person who hurt me. They alternate between panic and fury. They have the psychic disequilibrium. They have both love and hate towards their partner. They have both love and hate towards their attorney. They pursue divorce and reject divorce simultaneously. They're help-seeking and help-rejecting. And they have this just they're very easily destabilized. And they're destabilized in the marriage by issues over intimacy, dependency, closeness, and attachment. The best way to deal with these individuals is to take a view of the long run. They're going to be with you a long time, because it's not going to be easy to get their case resolved. You have to be patient with them without allowing yourself to overreact to their abruptness, because they may come in with a completely different point of view the next time you see them over the course of a couple of meetings. And that may be true as parents, children you represent. You may find that they're back and forth about, I want supervised visitation, to no visitation, to maybe we could consider alternating weekends, to maybe we could work something out. In the meantime, they're trying to work out an arrangement with the father or the mother without ever telling you about it, and so forth. So you have to view this as dealing with it for the long run. You have to understand that they will have ambivalence about everything. And they're likely to eventually have ambivalence about you as an attorney. Okay. So they may fire you if you were representing them. They may fire you or try and have you removed from representing their child. And the next time you see them, they want you back on the case. Michelle?
So you said that it comes from being hurt by their caregiver.
Yes.
I'm assuming you don't mean physically hurt. You mean
Emotionally hurt.
emotionally hurt. And how would the caregiver emotionally hurt this kid?
The parent who denigrates the child, who criticizes the child, threatens to leave the child, the parent who says, I've had it, I'm walking out of the house, I'm leaving. The parent who threatens to abandon the child is the core of that.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we've gone through the different types of DSM-5 personality disorders, and maybe we could take a break, ask for questions, and then move on to hatred.
Yes.
Would that be, do we have any questions in the room? Right there. Oh, we got,
I'd just ask you to cover a couple of cautionary things. One would be comorbidity, differential diagnosis, and the difference between characteristics and disorders.
that's a frank question all the way, isn't it? Sorry, Dr. Alabiso.
I was hoping you'd answer that.
Yeah, no. That's why I defer to the expert.
To reach diagnosis for any of these patterns, and this is why I opened by saying what you're likely to see are various traits, and that's why I tried to identify the traits for you rather than the full-blown disorder. Okay? But to reach diagnosis, you have to have a majority of those traits. So if there are 5 traits, you have to have at least 3 to come to diagnosis. Is there comorbidity? In some of these disorders, they present as an axis 1 disorder. So they present to you as if they are anxious, depressed, and so forth. But in fact, the underlying disorder is the personality disorder itself. So oftentimes what happens is that we misperceive them as depressed or anxious or struggling, when in fact what underlies that, the structure of their personality, they have 3 or more of those traits, majority of those traits, they actually have the disorder.
Dr. Alabiso, you talked about a lot what we can do to protect ourselves as attorneys from parents with these personality disorders. I guess my question is given the fact that these personality disorders are not amenable to treatment, what can we do to protect our children, clients, from these parents?
That's a really important question, because I think that, particularly with some of these more serious personality disorders, the issue comes up. One is does the disorder constitute a mental illness? Okay. Technically it does. It's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so the American Psychiatric Association would say that it's a mental illness. 2, does the nature of the parent's mental status, mental illness, compromise their parental capacity and their ability to parent the child? Now, that becomes more clear when you're talking about an Axis I disorder. If you have a schizophrenic parent, a paranoid personality parent, if you have a parent with a severe bipolar disorder, okay, where they're clearly compromised, they're delusional, they have hallucinations, they can't function, or severe depression where they can't get out of bed, can't get their kids to school on time, don't make lunch, don't remember to give the kid money for lunch. Those disorders are much clearer to the court. Okay. The personality disorders are more, the damage done is harder to see. So narcissistic parents, I think is easier for the court to see, that the parent is self-interested, willing to use or exploit the child in service of getting what they want from the other parent. So if we can illuminate that pattern for the court. Parents who have borderline personality disorder, they have this love-hate ambivalence in their relationship with their spouse, in their relationship with their attorney, and oftentimes in their relationship with their kids. So if that can be illuminated as it affects the relationship with the child, and the other parent is more loving, more giving, more stable, more caring, more fair-minded, that is helpful to the court. Do I answer your question? Yeah, good, okay.
I think
Hi.
hello there. I think I just dealt with a father that fits in 1 or 2 or all of these categories. And yeah, and it was a reassignment, so I had.
Are you happy?
Well, it's settled. It's settled, so I
sorry to
guess the
interrupt you.
answer
Go
is
ahead.
yes, right. And I had represented this kid several years ago, so I'd met the parents then. So I'm reassigned. Now there's a second child. So the parents have, and I don't know if this is politically correct or not, but an unholy partnership. There's abuse, they separate, so this second go around, there's a new baby. Okay, the father comes in, he wants the same thing with the new kid, the mother doesn't want him to have, it's all over the map. This guy makes me nervous because he's big and he's a liar. I met him before. He was sitting in my office 4 years ago, and I said, what am I wasting my time for? The guy's just making up an answer. Okay, so here we are now. I write letters, he doesn't respond. He decides he wants to meet with me. I insisted that his attorney, he did have an attorney, I would meet with him with the attorney present. Mainly because I wanted this guy to hear the BS he was going to tell me, because I was pretty sure that's what I was going to hear. I did. And partly it was the guy physically makes me nervous because he's big and I know he's an abuser. I'm not big and I'm not an abuser, so I took care of myself. And it's so clear you can't get very far with someone like this. And what he started with to ask for was so far away from what he ended up he really wanted. It's like, what a waste. You know, it's settled. But to answer some of these questions about how do you deal with parents like this, I made sure I felt protected. There's nothing really I can do for this family.
You have to protect yourself always.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And some of these folks scare us. They scare us. So you have to protect yourself. The reality that we know in cases like this, particularly where you get what in psychiatry is called a folie à deux, the madness of two people, where you have both partners have personality disorder traits. Okay, so it's a particular kind of craziness between the two of them. Okay, is that the fact is that there is no remedy at law for these cases. There's nothing that a court can decide that will ultimately end in a resolution of conflict for your client, for the child. So where does it show up? It shows up in gatekeeping after the court makes its decision. Okay? So gatekeeping has to do with parents who are constantly trying to disrupt the child's relationship with the other parent. These are the parents that don't let parent one come over to the kid during a game. Okay? These are the parents who show up 45 minutes late, time after time, for the access exchange, disrupting plans. These are the parents who, when one parent or the other sends gifts, cards for birthday and so on and so forth, they don't give them to the kid. They're constantly communicating. They schedule competing activities during the other parent's access time. Okay? And it goes on in the form of gatekeeping after the court decision is made. Ultimately, they wind up coming back to court again and again and again. There's no remedy under law. Well, hopefully, these kids grow up.
Well, actually, there is sort of a remedy. In one of the examples I gave, I think the one with the bruised and battered buttocks, the way that that particular fact pattern happened to cross my desk is the mom and her new husband had brought an adoption proceeding in surrogate's court, and that dad was gone. So, yeah, there's a remedy now and then, but not too often. Judge
Dr.
Buchanan.
Alabiso, you just mentioned the madness of two people. Just follow up on that. Are there any common situations where some of these disorders match up with couples, where one type of this disorder will be more apt to connect with the other type, another type of disorder?
The answer,
Follow that? You know what I mean? Like, you know, one fits with the other.
yeah, the answer is yes. It's where you get a pattern of personality traits in one person that then works actually during the course of the marriage and before the breakup. The pattern actually works. So it's not uncommon for me doing a custody evaluation to do some psychological testing to look at the personality traits of, longstanding personality traits of each parent. And so sometimes I'll see this pattern where one parent, typically the father, is domineering, sees himself as the decision maker, and is controlling. And so we're starting to see a pattern of narcissism with this parent, and maybe some obsessive compulsive disorder. And then you look to the mother's personality traits, and her personality traits are that she's dependent, she's avoidant, she's submissive, she's willing to compromise in order to avoid conflict with this guy. Now comes the divorce. Okay? And in the divorce, you start to see one or the other of those parents change. Usually the parent who's submissive, dependent, avoidant begins to change, goes into therapy, learns to become more assertive, learns to stand up for themselves, and learns to be not so conflict avoidant. Now you have more conflict than you did to begin with because she's now standing up to him, and he's fighting back through lawyers and through the court system. So there's a healthy process of individuation and separation going on there psychologically. But in the period of time that that's going on, you're actually likely to see more disruption, not less disruption. Prior to that, their personalities complemented one another, not for the healthiest of reasons, but it worked. They had a much more functional co-parenting relationship. Once she began to change, they argued over everything.
How about, do we have any other questions? And
Yes,
then we're going
I'll
to
just ask very quickly, if perhaps you can help me with this personality and tell me which one it is. This parent that, I don't know, just lacked logic completely. I'll give you an example. The judge said, okay, he said, Mom is always violating the petition. Judge said, okay, then document it, call the police, and when she's 1 minute late, he calls the police. So he has like 20 violations that he esteemed to be violations for nothing. I said to him, you know what, okay, she's working. I know Mom is working. Okay, go investigate it. I shouldn't have said that. He went to the company, sent letters to the CEO, accused her of all the worst things. No, that's not what I said. That's not what I meant at all. He just takes it one step beyond
Right.
logic.
That's right.
Just the last one. His visit is on Thursdays. He's now working on Thursdays. So Mom gave him Wednesday because he's off on Wednesday. For some reason, they're fighting about it. I get an email. I get 8 calls from one, 11 from the other. So I just sent an email because I don't want to speak to Dad anymore because everything I say he takes it out of context. So I said, go back to the custody order. Now, he knows he had visit on Wednesday. So he showed up nonetheless on Thursday morning with the police to have his visit because I said, go back to the custody order. No logical, reasonable person would say, you had it yesterday. Don't go today. Not him. How do you diagnose such a person? How do you deal with them?
This is an obsessive compulsive pattern where there's a focus, there's rigidity, inability to be flexible. There's a focus on perfectionism, okay, and a concealment of discordant attitudes, a concealment of his ill will towards this mother, or his belief that he's protecting his child by being so precise. And the perfectionism drives everyone frantic, including the child, actually. Younger children don't sense it so much, but as children get older and start to individuate, they themselves begin to feel that pressure for perfectionism. So in a case like that, you're dealing with, and the example you gave, it sounds like a full-blown personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And so the problem becomes the precision about interpreting everything literally. 10 o'clock pickup is not 10 o'clock 30 seconds or 10:01. And then you have them, remember, obsessive-compulsive individuals align themselves with authority. Okay? So they go to the police. The order says 10 o'clock. And they go to the police. The officer comes and says, this is a family court matter. I really can't help you. There's no crime here. Take it back to court. They do. Okay, they do. Okay, and that will go on, can go on indefinitely because it is the nature of their personality. Okay, so then you start to get this criminalization of family problems, calls to the police, frivolous complaints, calls to Child Protective Services over details that don't rise to the level of constituting an abuse or a mistreatment, a neglect or an inadequate guardianship. And you start to get a pattern of this building over time. The child and the other parent are just completely inundated by this and overwhelmed. And so what you're looking for I mean, as a psychologist, if I was doing a custody evaluation in this case, what I'd be looking for is presenting the argument to the court to help the court understand that this pattern is ongoing, it's probably not going to change. We have to come up with a parenting plan that keeps these parents as separate as possible. They shouldn't be expected to co-parent. They shouldn't have joint custody. They should have maybe a parallel parenting plan. The father, in that case, will, if there's a parallel parenting plan, he will follow the court order to the letter. The problem is that he expects that of the mother and the child. Okay? And we have to try and keep them, we have to come up with a parenting plan that keeps them as separate as possible. Or their communication should be written, it should be email, not discussions on the telephone. We shouldn't expect them to co-parent. We should try and foster separateness. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go on, but I want to say something. In your particular crazy family, the family wizard might be helpful in terms of documenting what goes on. I don't know if you're familiar with the program, but the great thing about it is once you make a post, you can't delete it. So it's pretty great about documenting. The other thing is, I understand it's interpretation issues. The other thing I want to ask the doctor, and I don't know if you're prepared to address this, but sometimes these personality problems, I've sensed over the years as an AFC that sometimes these persistent beliefs cross, in my opinion, to neglect of the child because it becomes difficult for the child to manage. For example, a persistent belief that a child is being abused or neglected, and numerous examinations and interviews. Do you think that that can happen as a result?
It does happen, and there's probably not a person in this room who hasn't seen that, where, again, these frivolous calls to the police and child protective services, the criminalization of family problems, these repeated calls to child protective services to investigate. If these spill over into allegations of sexual abuse, it starts out, we have kids who are being interviewed in school by the CPS worker. Then if they're taking off their shirt to see if there's bruises. It's very difficult for the child. And then if it morphs over into allegations of sexual abuse, then if it's many of the questions that are being asked of the child are more intrusive, if they have to go to the Family Advocacy Center and be physically examined, and so on and so on and so forth. And I think that there's a statute that allows Child Protective Services itself to consider these frivolous, ongoing deluge complaints to constitute a form of child abuse itself.
Do you think, doctor, that there's one of these personality types that's more apt to make those frivolous claims?
You're more likely to see it in a pattern of parental alienation than any place else. So not speaking so much to parenting, a personality type, but a family dynamic. You're most likely to see it in cases of parental alienation. Now, it touches on our next topic, which has to do with hatred, because much of what you see in parental alienation cases is the manifestation of hatred.
So, doctor, why don't you start by talking about what you mean by hatred, and then I'll give a fact example that you could discuss.
Okay. Hatred is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, that hatred is, every one of us in this room has or will encounter hatred in the course of our professional career. It's not happening so very often that we'll get a lot of, many of those cases, or that we'll encounter it many times during the course of a career, but it is happening often enough and it's memorable enough that you remember those cases. 10 years from now, you'll remember that case. Hatred is little addressed in the literature, the professional literature. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as I mentioned, it's only mentioned twice in the 500-plus page, 700-plus page volume. It's only mentioned twice and never mentioned in context of a personality disorder, and it's because not much is known about it. But the definition of hatred is a strongly negative global assessment of the former partner who is judged to be undeserving of respect as a spouse, a parent, or a human being. In other words, the parent who hates sees the other parent as despicable, as unworthy of any consideration, kindness, courtesy, and is obsessed with a desire to destroy that parent.
So let's talk about Doug. Doug's mom and dad separate when Doug's about 3. The cause of the separation is mom has an affair with an underage boy and is criminally charged. The court directs access between Doug and mom, at first supervised, and then when the criminal charges are dropped, unsupervised. Dad absolutely and totally refuses to comply with visits. He believes mom has no value to Doug. The criminal event was 9 years ago, but Dad always produces the charging documents and waves them around at every opportunity to support his claim that mom should not have access with Doug. When mom does manage to have access, Dad undercuts the access by cutting the time short, criticizing the gifts she gives, and otherwise interfering with the boy's ability to enjoy any time with his mother.
So we have 2 types of hatred. We have reactive hatred, and we have what's referred to in the literature as entrenched hatred. So this case of Doug is more like a case of reactive hatred. Reactive hatred is when one parent leaves the other parent, whether they've been unfaithful or they leave for other reasons. The parent who is left is humiliated. They find themselves to be narcissistically injured by the rejection. And as a result of that, they develop this intense need to emotionally shame, denigrate, humiliate, and destroy the former spouse. In reactive hatred, it's driven by a reaction to situational factors. And reactive hatred is amenable to change over time. Once the parent recovers from the narcissistic injury, which may take 2 or 3 or more years, but once they recover from the narcissistic injury, they're more willing to move on with their life and not make the damage and destruction of the other parent their focus in life. But during the period of time that they are reacting with hatred, they're obsessed with wanting to hurt the other parent. And they'll go through great lengths to be able to do that, and they'll try and humiliate and embarrass the other parent where they can. And of course, the child is subject to all of that, and it's very damaging to children. If you look at the other form of hatred, entrenched hatred, this is a pattern of individuals who react out of their own personality type. Okay? So one of the things that differentiates reactive hatred from entrenched hatred is typically the parent who has entrenched hatred is the one who leaves the other parent. They're not narcissistically injured. They haven't been cheated on. They haven't been abandoned, as is the case in reactive hatred. The entrenched parent is often the one who leaves, and it baffles us. We think, well, like, she left him. What is she angry at him about? Or he left her. What is he angry at her about? Okay, it's this entrenched hatred. Individuals with this pattern present with these characteristics. They are considered, often behave in ways in which people consider them to be despicable. So when we meet people with entrenched hatred, what you'll find is there are people in their lives who find them to be despicable. For us, as therapists, psychologists, custody evaluators, or as attorneys for their children, we often find them to be despicable. Their behavior is marked by an obsessive focus on the object that they hate, and their obsession never ends. They're as angry and as despicable towards their former spouse 5 years later as they were on day one. It doesn't subside. Their hatred is embedded in their personality structure, doesn't change with the passage of time, and there's a willingness. This is another key characteristic. You'll recognize it when I say it. It's the willingness to incur harm to themselves and harm to their child in service of destroying that other parent. Okay? So these parents, they don't embrace the culture of the court. The culture of the court is to reduce conflict for the child. The culture of an entrenched hatred parent is to use the child to inflict pain on the other parent at the child's expense. Their hatred is all-consuming, and it is very difficult for us to find it within ourselves to have empathy for these folks because their behavior and their attitudes are so vile to us. When we try and look at entrenched hatred, the psychoanalysts had their own theory about entrenched hatred. They were the first to write about entrenched hatred. And what they said is that the hatred itself psychologically is a way of hanging on to the other parent. Okay? That just as love is a way of hanging on to the other parent, hatred becomes a way for them to the other parent. So we hear about these cases. I hope none of you have had them. I have had them. I hope none of you have. These cases where the father shoots the mother and commits suicide, leaves a note, now we'll be together forever. Entrenched hatred. I had a father who the mother was successful in getting an order of protection against him. He came into my office, showed me the order of protection, and he said to me, "This is my new marriage contract." Okay? This notion of we're bound together by hatred forever, as opposed to love. It's very pathological. Okay? So, later generations of mental health professionals who have looked at the personality structures of persons with entrenched hatred don't necessarily subscribe to this psychoanalytic theory that this is a way of holding on to the person even after a divorce, even after there's no love. Okay, what they found out was that in studying a small sample of these parents, that they looked at their childhood and they looked at how they were parented. And if you realize how they've been parented, you may even feel some sort of empathy, if not empathy, understanding for them. It's hard to be empathic, but it's at least some understanding. So when they interviewed these folks and took family histories and life histories, what they found was this, that their own parents had a paucity of sentiment, that their parents had a power orientation, that their parents were insensitive, that their parents lacked tenderness, that their parents had aggressive energies and were domineering and pugnacious, that their parents were people who take pleasure in intimidating others, who are abusive, who are undeterred by consequences, who are dogmatic, uncharitable, and emotionally cruel. So these individuals that we see who have this entrenched hatred grow up under this kind of regime of parenting. And some of those kids internalize that. It's who they become. And they act that out towards their spouse, or they act that out towards their own children.
So I think we're going to close our prepared remarks on a final fact pattern that I'm going to give you. I think it's an example of entrenched hatred. And this is sadly a very true case. David was one of 4 siblings. Mom's been difficult, kind of at best, her entire life. When David's 13, Mom initiates a divorce, claiming she can't stand another moment with Dad. Mom is clear with all 4 kids, either you love me or you love him, but you can't love us both. Pick. The 4 kids pick their mother. When David's 18, Mom remarries and tells David there's going to be no room in the new house for him and that he needs to find his own place to live. David's got a car that he bought with a part-time job, but because of the PIC, he feels absolutely estranged from his father and can't reach out to him. David takes the car, goes into the garage, closes the door, turns the car on, and commits suicide. Mom responds by telling Dad, "You may not attend the funeral," gives the car to David's younger brother, and sues Dad for the funeral bill. Would that be pretty much entrenched?
It's entrenched. It never ends.
That's true.
It's a true case. It never ends. It's designed to destroy the other person, to treat the other person as if they're not a human being. There's no indication of any concern for that other parent or recognition of that parent's loss or realization that that parent's anger could be justified. And it will go on, even beyond this, beyond suing for funeral costs. This will go on indefinitely, as long as the parties are alive.
Questions? No questions? We all understand hatred?
Have you had a case? Have you encountered reactive or entrenched hatred?
Christine's got one. Can we have a mic with Christine and one with Peter? Christine's in the middle.
I could be wrong, but please tell me. I think this is entrenched hatred. I had a situation where I represented a dad, and he and his ex-wife were constantly going back to court because their teenage son was opioid addicted, in and out of PINs and in and out of court proceedings. Mom was constantly blaming Dad, enabling the child, letting him do whatever he wanted. Dad was trying to help him, put him in, I think, one of the rehab centers locally for teenagers, and was trying to help him get a job, finish his school, and was setting rules at the house, whereas Mom had no rules. At one point, when this now young man was 18 or 19, briefly went to jail for some drug-related issue, came out, broke up with his girlfriend, killed himself, unfortunately. Mom had to cut her vacation short 3 days to come back to the funeral, and then refused to pay for the funeral because she justified it by saying she had a loss by having to cut her vacation short, so she wasn't going to do anything to help pay for her son's funeral.
That's hatred.
Front row.
I just have a question with regards to the fact pattern that you mentioned with the suicide. So if the focus is the hatred on the dad and she kicks the son out, but I'm assuming that she did know that the child was going to commit suicide. So how is that focused? How is the hatred focused on the father as opposed to her relationship with her son?
It was the cutout. He was using the children to get even with the dad for whatever reason, and it just continued. So the suicide was this child who had been subject to this campaign of hatred having no alternative. Am I articulating that correctly?
He had no way, in that case, psychologically, he had no way out. He had been essentially emotionally punished for wanting to have a relationship with his father. And the mother essentially abandoned him when he was 18. Just put him out of the house, stopped supporting him, stopped welcoming him into her home. And so here we have a child who emotionally has no place to go.
Ms. Roman?
I just have a quick question as to how to deal with a client with this intense hatred. I had a client, and I don't know if I handled her right, she ended up complying, but she had such intense hatred towards the dad that she would refuse visitation or access with the child. Dad was out of state, it got to the point where she actually had a willfulness violation or a violation against her where she was going to be incarcerated if she didn't allow the child to go for Christmas access. And very strict guidelines as to when to buy the plane tickets, to turn over the child's health card, everything, and she wouldn't do it. She was at the point where she was going to go to jail. And the way I handled it was I just kept almost enabling or agreeing with her, but telling her, look, you still have to do this over and over again, to the point where she finally complied at the end. How do you handle someone that has that kind of hatred towards the ex, to make sure, I represented her, not the child, but to make sure that the custody agreement is somewhat followed?
This is a situation where there really needs to be, I don't know if collaboration is the right word. There certainly needs to be a congruence between how the court views the case, how the attorneys view the case, and if there's a custody evaluator involved, how the custody evaluator views the case, which wasn't your situation. There was no custody evaluator involved. But these kinds of situations only get remediated, in my experience, when the court is willing to impose sanctions. Okay? Now, many judges are not willing to impose sanctions in these family court matters. Okay? But it takes the authority of the court. Takes it right up, in your case, takes it right up to, you could be facing incarceration if you don't comply. And these parents will resist, defy the court, be in contempt, be in contempt, be in contempt. You know, you can take away child support. You can order them to go to counseling. Counseling usually doesn't help. Okay? They have entrenched hatred. And the only thing that might get them to change the pattern is that they might give in order to save themselves. But there are those parents who will go to jail. And then they'll wear it like a badge. Look at what he did to me. Look at what the court did to me. And hate the other parent more, hate the court more, okay? Turn on their attorney. Yeah. But it takes a willingness on the court's part to impose a sanction.
There was the physician a bunch of years ago, I believe she was in Washington, D.C., who absolutely believed her child's father, who was also a physician, was molesting the child, absconded with the kiddo, had her parents take the kiddo to New Zealand. She was incarcerated for a rather substantial period of time, would never give up the location of that child. It's pretty intense.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening presentation. Thank you.